If you guys will open your Bibles tonight to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. Now, I know you're probably thinking, I thought we were in Revelation. Well, Matthew 24, Matthew 25, this is called the Olivet Discourse. And so the Olivet Discourse, it goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about in Revelation as we've been going through our end time study. And in fact, this is Jesus talking about the end times. And so he's talking to his disciples and he's giving them kind of an overview, a glimpse of what is about to happen. And so if you look back historically in some of the rabbinical writings, there's a rabbinical writing, it's known as the Midrash. There's a little saying in there, and it says that the land of Israel is at the center, well, they think it's at the center of the world. And so Jerusalem is at the center of the land of Israel, and then the temple is at the center of Jerusalem. So in other words, that's their way of saying that it's the very center of the earth, and it's the center of God's program on earth, essentially. And so they believe that's the temple in the city of Jerusalem. That's the center of everything that happens. And as we go through and we're looking at end times, and we're looking at prophecies, we're looking at what we're going to look at tonight in Matthew 24, essentially what we see is it is sort of the hub. It is the central picture of prophetic things when it comes to the end times. And so when we get to Matthew chapter 24, essentially Jesus he's with his disciples and they're overlooking the city of Jerusalem at this point. And so nowadays, if you were to go where they were sitting and you were to look from the Mount of Olives, the temple is no longer standing there. Now there is a dome of the rock that is sitting there. But back in the day when Jesus was with his disciples here, that's where the temple was standing. It was standing in its place. And so the disciples and Jesus, they're overlooking the city, and it's, swarming with people, maybe 1 million people there because it's the Passover season. And the disciples, they're discussing really, the city, they're discussing the temple. They're realizing and they're having conversations about how the temple, the city, this is all really the center of God's prophetic program here. And like I said, Jerusalem, it is the storm center prophetically. And so even the prophet Zechariah, he says, speaking of Israel, he says that Jerusalem is a very heavy stone for all of the nations of the world, those who are around them. And so what we see is this, is we're coming to a point, and what Jesus will even reference here in Scripture, and what we see in our culture, our time today, is that we're reaching a point where a lot of the nations of the world, they will look at Israel and they'll think that Israel is the roadblock that needs to go in order for peace and happiness to be established among their nations. That's what we see happening. You look at Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Iran and all these other nations that are really surrounding Israel, and they almost see Israel as this roadblock that just needs to go in order for there to be peace and happiness. And so that's really an unfortunate position to take, because that same prophet Zechariah, he said that God says Israel is the apple of my eye, and I will come against really any nation that comes against Israel, is what he says. So we see Israel or Jerusalem is really somewhat of the glory center of the earth ultimately, and that's where our whole text is coming to here tonight. Now Isaiah said in Isaiah 2:2-3, when speaking of the temple here, and I know you're like, why are we talking about the temple? Well, it would all make sense as we go on. And if anyone has questions or comments, it's a normal Wednesday night. You throw them out there. We'll get to them. So Isaiah says this in chapter 2, verses 2-3. He says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, 'Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.'" So we're setting up this whole story. We're setting up everything that's essentially going into Matthew chapter 24. And what you have to realize is, as we're going into Matthew chapter 24, we are in very Jewish ground. All right, so we need to look at this through Jewish eyes, not through American eyes. And so we're going to read things like the Judea and the Sabbath and the inhabitants of the city. And when we see that, it's referring to Judea, Jerusalem, the land of Israel. And so once again, this is called the Olivet Discourse. Why is it called the Olivet Discourse? Because the disciples are talking to Jesus, and he gives them this explanation, and they're all on the Mount of Olives. So it's called the Olivet Discourse. That's why it's named that. And so what he's doing here in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is speaking of the future. And so it's the future of Jerusalem, the future of the Jews, the future of the temple, essentially the future of the world, and he's speaking about his second coming. And so what we see here as we jump in tonight is this: in verse 1, Jesus and his disciples, they go out, they're leaving the temple, and his disciples, they stop and they turn around and they're looking at the buildings of the temple, and they're looking at how, vast and beautiful this thing is. And if you look at the account in the book of Mark, the disciples, they're really almost like their jaws are on the ground, and they're just, wow, this thing is incredible, this thing is beautiful, and they're going on and on and on. And then we see Jesus' response to this. So verses 1 and 2 here of Matthew 24, it says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So they're looking at this temple, they're talking about how vast, how beautiful it is, how incredible it is, and Jesus, he responds by saying, okay, cool, well, this whole thing's going to be gone, right? There won't be one stone left upon another, essentially is what he tells them. And so we have to understand something. 2,000 years ago, in the Jewish mind, in the disciples' mind, like we said, that temple, it's really the center of God's prophetic program. Not only is it that, but it's evidence that they are blessed. It's evidence that God is with them. It's a sign that God is on their side, and his presence is still there. That's how they looked at the temple. And so if you remember with the temple, they began building the temple probably around 20 BC. This was Herod's temple, essentially is what they referred to it as. It wasn't finished until around 64 AD, which is pretty crazy because then it was destroyed in 70 AD. But they say it took 18,000 men about 80 years to build this. So you can imagine for some men, this was their entire life. It went into building this temple. And so really what we see is that some people believe that the temple actually was never fully completed before it was destroyed in 70 AD. And when you're speaking of this mountain, this temple, it's really a mountain complex is what it is. So it's a mountain that has a peak, and it was leveled off, and there was this retaining wall, and then they brought in all of this field dirt to essentially create this vast area that was about 36 acres. So it was this giant complex built into the side of this mountain. And so there was 158 feet from the very top of the temple that they called the pinnacle of the temple, and 158 feet from that all the way down to the bottom, which was the Kidron Valley. And so when we say the pinnacle of the temple, you recognize that, right? Because that's where Satan took Jesus. When he was tempting him, he took him up on the pinnacle of the temple. He said, throw yourself down, because the angels, they got charge over you. They're not going to let you dash your foot against a stone. And so we've heard that, right? So that's the pinnacle area. That's what we're referring to here when we're talking about the temple. We see that the temple was made out of marble, and it was made out of gold, and there was gold lattices, and there was all of this gold embroidered, and there was gold on top of the marble. There was gold and marble all throughout it. In fact, the Babylonian Talmud, it says, he who has never seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful temple. And so this temple was absolutely magnificent. It was beautiful. And in fact, some of the stones that are left from the retaining wall that are there, they weigh up to 400 tons. And so usually when you talk about the ancient world and you talk about giant stones, people get very confused as of how they were moved. I mean, you think about modern day equipment we have now, these big cranes, and they can lift maybe like a ton, 2 tons, maybe 5 tons, but 400 tons. These stones are massive, they're huge. And so we see in 70 AD that the temple was destroyed because a Roman guard, he threw a torch into the temple, and it caught some of the vestments. It caught the veil on fire. And so then what happened when the temple burned is all of the gold that had been laced throughout and had been put on top of the marble and it all melted. And as it melted, it went down inside of those marble stones. And so all of that melted down inside of there. Well, the Roman soldiers, the Roman the ones who burned the temple, they were filled with greed, and so they're not going to just let all of that gold go to waste. So what did they do? They went in and they picked apart every stone that was in there until they found out every single piece of gold that had melted down inside the stones. And thus, the prophecy that Jesus speaks here, saying not one of these stones would be left upon another, it's accomplished. Why? Because of the greed of the Romans. So we see that they literally took the entire thing apart so that they could gut it of any gold that had melted down into these stones. And so the temple, or the destruction of the temple, it was so complete, it was so vast that Josephus, the historian, when he wrote about it, he said somebody who's visiting Jerusalem after the destruction, they would have never guessed that that city had ever been inhabited or that a temple ever stood there. That's how great the destruction was. And so we see Jesus' words here are prophetic, and it actually came about. And so, as I say, even though there are archaeological pieces that are still there, some of those big stones, it's actually debated as far as where the temple stood. And so there's a debate between that and the Dome of the Rock that stands there now. So let's continue on, verse 3. It says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Or what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So the disciples, they come to him and they ask this question, right? They say, well, what is the sign of your coming? What is the signs of the end of the age? And essentially the entire answer to that Jesus gives is written here in Matthew chapter 24. It's a legitimate question. And like I said, Jesus will spend the rest of this chapter answering that for them. And so they said, what is the sign of your coming? And you see the word coming here. The word coming it's the Greek word parasuo. And what it means is, what is the sign of your coming is your glorious appearing. What is the sign of your personal presence, your glorious appearing essentially to the world? And so today when we hear that question, when we read it, we're thinking, because of the information that we have, right? We're thinking about Jesus' second coming. But when the disciples asked Jesus this question, they were actually thinking about his first coming, the glorious appearing, his parasua of the Messiah. And so when they said, tell us, when will these things be and what is the sign of your coming? The when, the answer that they were looking for is tomorrow or 2 days from now or maybe at the end of Passover. They weren't thinking like years and years and years and years and years into the future. They were thinking immediate, and they wanted Jesus to gloriously appear and present himself as the king and as the Messiah, as the ruler. And so when they ask this question, again, they're not thinking about the second coming. They're thinking of the first coming, and they're thinking it should happen any day now. And so a little more insight into all of this. In Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that as Jesus was approaching Jerusalem, it says he told them a parable. Why? Because they thought that the kingdom of God would appear immediately. So they're thinking that, this is his first coming. He's going to come and he's going to declare himself to be king and Messiah. I mean, he's here. He just needs to have his parasua. He needs to come out to the people as who he is. And so you see a couple days before they wrote that, or before this instance was happening here, if you remember the accounts, Jesus riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, and everyone is saying, Hosanna, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is our King of Israel. And so to them, to the disciples, seeing what they had just seen, seeing all of these things, this is a significant sign. This is a signal that something is about to happen, prophetically. And so they think he's going to come and he's going to make his glorious appearing at any moment. And so that's why they ask him this question. And so they're probably thinking, that whole donkey ride thing, that was pretty cool. But when are you going to make it known? When are you going to let everybody know that you are the Messiah? When is your parasua? And so, again, we have to keep some other things in mind. As I said, we need to think through the lens of the Jewish mind instead of the American mind. I talked a little bit about the eschatology of the Jews, right? So in the mind of the disciples, they were Jewish. They had a pretty fixed eschatology that was based off of their culture and their religious beliefs. Now, if you don't know what eschatology is, that's what we did a couple weeks ago, where we walked you through all of the, differing opinions on the rapture and all of the differing opinions on the millennial kingdom. And so the Jewish individuals, they had their own eschatology. They had their own idea of when things would happen or what they would look like when they happened. And it was based off of their culture, their religion. The first thing, and I've talked through these before with you guys, but the first thing on the list is they believed that there would be turmoil in the land, specifically turmoil for the Jewish nation. And so they saw this as already being fulfilled in this time when Jesus was there. Why? Because of the Roman occupation. And so the Romans, they were in control. So they're thinking, check, that checks the box there where the world is in turmoil, especially our world. And so then the second thing that they were looking for, according to their eschatology, was a forerunner or a herald. They believed it was an Elijah-like forerunner who would come heralding, predicting, announcing the coming of the Messiah. So when you see that that's what they were looking for as far as their eschatology is concerned, it's no wonder that everyone was flocking to the Jordan River to see John the Baptist, this crazy guy who's eating locusts and dressing himself in, camel hair or whatever it is that he was wearing. They're flocking to him at the river because they're saying, this is a sign of the coming. This is a sign of the Messiah's parasua. So they think about John the Baptist, they say, check, right? The forerunner has come. The third thing that they were looking for was they believed that the Messiah would appear and he would defeat all of his enemies. The fourth thing that they were looking for is that all of the scattered Jews that were all over the world, essentially at that point, would all come together. They would come back to Israel and Jerusalem would be set up, and the kingdom would be established and set up, and then he would reign, the Messiah would reign from the temple in Jerusalem. So that's what they believe is coming down the pipeline. They think right now they're somewhere between number 2 and 3. So they say we've seen turmoil, we've seen the forerunner, but now we're waiting for the Messiah to come and just set up his kingdom here within the temple. So when Jesus answered them, and he's talking about the temple being destroyed, you have to understand that completely threw off their thinking. Because they're thinking, well, I have a problem with that. If Jesus has just predicted that the temple, the very center of everything that we think is coming down the pipeline, the very place where he's supposed to reign from, if he's predicting that that's going to be destroyed, then we have a serious problem. How can you be our Messiah, our deliverer, if the temple that you're supposed to reign from is going to be destroyed? And so they don't understand. And so that's when they say, well, what will be the sign then of your coming, your parasua? And so, they're thinking he's going to come and take over the world. He's going to rule from Jerusalem. But now you're saying the temple's destroyed. It's gone. And so let's fast forward to today's time, right? Today's age. And let's just say, from a modern standpoint, from where we are now, what are the next events that we're looking forward to? Does anybody know? The rapture. That's where we're at, right? Essentially, at this point, we're looking forward to two more events. The first event would be where Jesus comes down for his church, essentially in the sky. We meet together with him in the sky, the rapture. The second event is where Jesus comes all the way to the earth and touches down with his church. This is where we return with him. It's his second coming. And so there's a huge difference. And if you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, we go back and watch the videos. We went into great detail on all of that. But we see the first event that we're waiting on now is the rapture of the church. The second is the second coming, where the church returns with Christ. And in fact, that second coming is his parasua. Because the first time he came as the lamb, and the second time he's coming as the lion. So he's coming back as the reigning and the ruling king. And so we see, from our vantage point in history, we see that is his parasua, but they were looking at it through Jewish eyes, and they were thinking, he's here now. This has to be, when it's all going to happen. And so, according to the Bible, Jesus, at some time in the future, he's going to come out of heaven towards earth. He's going to rapture the church. Again, we've talked about this. We saw that 1 Thessalonians 4 says we're taken up to meet the Lord in the air. And then after a period of tribulation, when we get through the book of Revelation, essentially, and that whole tribulation period is actually largely written about here in Matthew 24, which is why we're going through it here tonight. Jesus will come all the way to the earth with his church to rule and to reign. And so he's going to come back. Where's he going to come back to? The Mount of Olives. And so if you remember, when Jesus ascended, all the disciples are just dumbfounded looking up in the air, and then the angels come and they're like, why are you guys just staring in the air? They said, don't you realize he's going to come back? He's going to come back in the same manner. He's going to come to the Mount of Olives. He's coming back with his church. And so the focus of Matthew 24 It's not the rapture, and it's not prior to the rapture. It's not the church age. It's not where we are. But the focus of Matthew 24 is the second coming, and it's the events that happen in Jerusalem particularly, but also that affect all over the world, and all of the believers or people who are left and essentially give their hearts and lives to Christ during that time period. And so it's talking about the Jewish believers, and that's why we know that when we move into the tribulation, we're shifting our focus back to the Jews. We're shifting our focus back to God's set apart people from the Old Testament. And so we're going to break down this passage tonight to see exactly what's being referenced as we go through it. In verses essentially 3 through 14, I know we read 3, we'll hit it again here. Jesus is giving them just general signs of the end of the age. And as referenced above, as I just said, let's see what time it is. These are references to things that are happening during the tribulation, and I'm going to give you some comparisons as we go through here. So let's read verses 3 through 14. It says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?' And Jesus answered them, 'See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.'" Very positive stuff, right? Great stuff, happy stuff. And so we see here Jesus several times throughout this passage, he uses the word you in this passage. And so when he says you, he's not speaking directly to the disciples that are sitting there listening. And this is where some people incorrectly interpret this passage. When he says you, he's referring to the Jews who will go through the tribulation period. Now, there are some who try and interpret this passage to mean that Jesus was speaking directly to these disciples, and then they believe essentially that the destruction of the temple that we'll see in 70 AD marked essentially the end of the church age, which doesn't really make sense in my opinion, and that moved them into the millennial reign. Now, we talked about that view, and I'll say this. You have to take everything else figuratively at that point and not literally if you're going to follow that view. But if you believe that, you're entitled to be wrong. No, I'm just kidding. All right. And so he's speaking here, as we're going through this, he's speaking to the ones who are saved during the tribulation period. And so you might ask, are there really going to be that many people who get saved during that time? Well, we see that there's a work of the 144,000, those marked Jewish virgins that are out essentially spreading the word, and then we see the work of the 2 witnesses. And in fact, you guys may remember, I told you that I've been taught that the tribulation period it's the greatest time of persecution that the world will ever see, but it will also be one of the greatest times of revival that the world has ever seen. And so we'll see that there will be people coming to Christ. There will be essentially revival, but at the same time, there will be great persecution that falls upon the earth. And so let me just kind of walk through some of what we just read here in Matthew. So let's get back to verses 4 and 5. You don't have to go back. I'm not going to read it specifically, but it mentions, and it says, many will come in Christ's name and deceive many. And so what we see is as we're walking through these things in Matthew 24, it's literally almost laying out a timeline of things that are happening throughout the book of Revelation. And so it says, many will come in Christ's name and deceive many. We see in Revelation 13, specifically verses 1 through 18, we see the beast, we see the Antichrist comes. We know that he comes proclaiming himself essentially to be Christ. We see that they have a false prophet. In fact, there's an unholy trinity just as there is a holy trinity. And so there's Satan, there's Antichrist, and then there's the false prophet. And so we see that these two come essentially to deceive the nations. And so this is what Matthew 24, 4 through 5 is referencing here. Now, Matthew 24, verses 6 through 7, it says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation." And so as we move into Revelation chapter 6 later on, what you're going to see is we're opening the seal judgments. And when we get to that second seal judgment, it's pictured as a rider on a red horse. And that rider on the red horse, it represents bloodshed. It represents wars. And so we're going to see that during the time of the tribulation that there will be increased, instability and conflict that's happening. There will be increased bloodshed and warring that happens all throughout that time period. In fact, I believe that a lot of those wars and things that are breaking out will be kind of a catalyst for the Antichrist to be able to come in and maybe sign peace treaties and catapult him to his position through peaceful takeovers, essentially, is what we'll see. And so Matthew 24, 67 there, when it's talking about rumors of wars, we're literally referencing the second seal. We're referencing the rider on the red horse. Verse 7 continues on and says, there will be famines. And so we see this is the third seal. There's the rider on the black horse. The black horse, the rider on the black horse literally represents famine. And so we see during that time period, there's going to be, scarcity. There's going to be economic hardship. In fact, if you've read through Revelation, you know that at several points throughout the story, it will say, a third of all of the green things on the earth are burned up by fire. And then it'll say a third of the fish in the sea are dead, and a third of the drinkable water is gone. And so it's not hard for us to imagine that there's going to be economic hardship at that time and that there's going to be famine. We can imagine that from the things that are going on there. Verse 7 also talks about pestilence. And so we see, and that's another thing that's coming along with the rider on the black horse. We see famine and pestilence. And so we see plague and sickness that's coming right along with them. So disease is a big part of the global judgment that's going to be coming. And then verse 7 also says, there will be earthquakes in various places. And so if you read throughout the book of Revelation, you'll see essentially 4 times in the book of Revelation where it lists major earth-shaking earthquakes that happen. So there's Revelation 6:12, Revelation 8:5, Revelation 11:13, Revelation 16:18. And so we see that during that time, natural disasters will increase and they will intensify. And so we've even seen that happening now. We see that natural disasters and earthquakes and volcanoes and things have intensified. They're getting greater. It's only going to get worse. And then when we move into the time of the tribulation, it's going to get much worse. That's what it's telling us here. And in verse 9, it says, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And so we see, if you remember when they opened the 5th seal, which I said remember, we haven't got there yet, but I'm assuming you've read it before. When they open that 5th seal, what we see is it's the martyred souls of the saints from that tribulation period, and they come out and they're crying for justice. And so when Jesus is walking through Matthew 24 here, he's literally laying out some of these judgments that are coming almost perfectly in order for us, the seal judgments here. And then as we move down further into our text, we're going to see there's more references that he was giving us that almost gives us a clear picture of the things that are going to come during that time. So now verse 8, it says, all these things. So what are these things? Everything that is just described. We have pestilence, we have famine, we have war, deception, all of these things happening, it says, is the beginning of sorrows. And so the literal translation is, it's all these are the beginning of the sorrows of birth. In fact, I read the ESV up here, and what it said was the beginning of birth pains. Now, I've never given birth, I will tell you that much, but most of you women have. And you can attest that all pregnancies, they have a certain amount of pain that comes along with it, right? It's nothing in comparison to a man's cold, but just kidding. Just kidding. But there's a certain amount of pain that comes along with childbirth. And there's also, leading up to the time where it's time to give birth, there's also contractions, right? And so when that pain and those contractions, when they become more frequent and more intense, what do? You start timing them. They say, between 4 to 6 minutes, you better get to the hospital pretty quickly. And the shorter that they get, that's the signal, that's the sign that it's coming. It's going to be there. And what Jesus is saying is look for these signals, look for these signs. The more that you see these birth pains, but what is he signifying? What is he saying is coming? He's not talking about the tribulation coming. This is happening in the tribulation. What he's saying, the birth that it's referring to, is his second coming. And so he's saying all these things, the birth pains that we see here, they precede the actual birth. And so the birth pains that we see, the earthquakes, the pestilence, all of these things, we see that they are the time of tribulation and the things that these people are going to have to be dealing with as they go through this time of tribulation. And then the actual birth and reference here is the second coming of Christ. And so, and you may say, there's wars right now, there's earthquakes right now. Yes, there's always been wars, there's always been deception, there's always been earthquakes, there's always been famines and pestilence, but when we start seeing these things become more prevalent, when we see them happening more frequently and more intense, you know that the time is very short. And so, if you read the book of Revelation, you see, the contractions throughout the tribulation. You see the judgments. There's the 7 seal judgments, the 7 trumpet judgments, the 7 bowl judgments that are all there. And then we see it all culminates in one epic battle at the end where Jesus returns with his church. He brings his glorious kingdom in. He ushers in essentially the millennial reign, just as predicted. And so these birth pains, as I said, the pains themselves are a reference to the catastrophes that they're having to deal with during the tribulation, but the birth is a reference to the second coming of Christ. And so, again, those disciples that heard this message, when it says you, it's not referencing them directly. Why? Because these things didn't come to pass in their lifetime. They never saw the stars fall out of the heavens, and they never saw the sun lose its light, and they never saw the heavens go dark as predicted in verse 29 when we get there. So when he says you, he's not specifically speaking to those disciples. He's speaking about the Jews that will have to go through that tribulation period. And then we see in verses 12 and 13, it says, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And so we read that, and some people think, well, is this a contradiction, right? Is during the tribulation period. And I actually had a friend of mine, he went off on me because he knows I'm a dispensationalist, and he said, well, you don't believe that, during the tribulation period that those Jews will come to Christ through the blood of Christ. Like, you believe that if they endure. And I'm like, no, I don't believe that at all. I don't know where you're getting that. I guess that's something they believe about dispensationalists, but that's not what I believe. I've never believed that. In fact, what you find is throughout the tribulation period, those who get saved, they still come to Christ in the same way that everyone else does. They still have to put their saving faith in him, in the blood of Jesus that has been shed for them, the atoning work that he has done. But people will read this passage and they'll say, well, what is this saying? If they endure the hardship of the tribulation, then they'll be saved. So essentially what this is saying is that those who endure to the end, it's showing a proof of the fact that they have given their hearts and lives to him. It's a proof to everyone else that they're willing to continue to follow him in the midst of everything that's happening around them. And so they say those who endure to that's a proof that they have truly given their hearts and lives to Christ.